Hello, good afternoon. My name is Russell KABIR, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hiroshima University. Today I'll be giving a brief lecture on English communication in context, using real examples from my own classes, as well as a sample of some of the assignments that I use using multimedia, such as podcasts, and unique features of my course, such as debate. So today I'd like to talk to you about English communication in context, language, nonverbal, and social features as cross-cultural learning opportunities. I recently moved into a new apartment, and I know that many of you are working on the transition from home to the university, or maybe you're thinking about it soon. I was walking with my girlfriend and I heard her say, "Do you still want to move into that mansion?" Mansion? I thought, oh no, my girlfriend thinks that I'm a really wealthy man. No, I'm not Debbie Fujin or Maezawa Yusaku or Jay Gatsby. I'm in fact just a mere professor here at Hiroshima University. So, to the everyday native English speaker, this word, mansion, means something quite different from the meaning in Japanese. As everyone here is probably a native Japanese speaker, I think there's nothing suspicious about this for you. But for me, this word mansion causes a big issue. Oh no! It's not an apartment, it's a very rich manor, a huge place where people can have many occupants. So I began to wonder, where does the word mansion come from in English and Japanese? Here is a photo I took during my time in Paris. This is actually from the Grand Trianon at the Palace of Versailles. Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette's location. Indeed, in modern French, there is a word called manoir or le château, which is a word for a place where people live, a house. But in my intuition, the word mansion comes from French, and in fact, it comes from Old French, and even earlier to Latin, from the Latin for manere, or manere, to remain. So the reason this is interesting for me is that my English speaker intuition thinks that this word comes from French, and in Japanese the word also seems to come from French, but the Japanese yurai, origin, is a bit different. It comes from the 1960s in Japan, where real estate agents, fudosan, used this word to make a kind of catchy slogan to sell apartments. So, what is happening with language that we can have two words, the same word, but have two different meanings? Well, this is a phenomenon in linguistics called false friends, or itsuari no tomo, in French, faux amis. This is a linguistic phenomenon for words that sound or look similar across languages, but can differ greatly in their meaning. For example, in our case, we have the word mansion in Japanese. To English, if you'd like to use it, you might say, "Hey, do you want to move into that mansion?" But in fact, we have Ludwig von Wittgenstein here to help us warn us that no, in fact, if your plan is to use the word mansion in English, you should be careful that it is a kind of false friend. So in my courses, I like to engage critical thinking skills. The critical thinking skill I'd like you to try is to identify. Can you think of any other examples of Japanese words that might actually be false friends with English? I'll give you a second to think about it. What do you say? Could you think of some? One for me that I hear all the time is this Japanese word, image. The word image is often used to express a kind of visualization in the mind, something that you are imagining when you're discussing a new concept. However, to image as a verb in English is quite different. This meaning comes from a meaning like rentogen, or to take an image of the body. It's often the usage. So usually to do image suru, we say imagine in English. This is an example of a word that many Japanese speakers of English struggle with. Another one is about, aboutona. This kind of adjective form of the word about is very handy, very useful in Japanese. However, in English, it can sort of narrow the only usage of about for you. So it's something as Japanese speakers of English or as foreign language learners of English to be careful of, because this about is not quite always there. It's correct to say a rough approximation of, but you don't want to limit the usage of about in everyday English. Another one is this word challenge. So challenge has a special meaning in Japanese, especially to think about the word like chosen, or to challenge. But really, when we challenge to challenge in English, we are talking about stating a position or having a point of view and wanting to argue against another's point of view. So it doesn't really capture the Japanese nuance of challenge shitai, or I want to take on the challenge of doing maru maru. So this is another false friend to be careful of. Another one you might have come across is the word purinto, print. So this print in English doesn't quite come back from the Japanese. This is because to print is really a general word like insatsu, right? The word for print in this case, like what you get in class, is handout, because it's something that you hand out. So in that way, this word is a kind of false friend. So please be careful. As I mentioned, a unique feature of my course are podcast assignments. These are to give you an opportunity to engage and build upon your speaking ability or your spoken English skills. First, I like to give my students recommendations for podcasts in order to get this exposure and listen on their own time. And they might even pick up a new hobby in the form of podcasts. Some podcasts I recommend with some decent English content are Kate ni EJ, English Journal, the TEFology podcast, teaching English as a foreign language, and the History of English podcast. Many of my courses are focused on English majors or people who want to learn English with cultural content. So I especially recommend podcasts such as these. But even more, my students themselves get to make their own podcasts. So this is one of the most exciting parts of my course at Hiroshima University. I asked them to make one on the topic of false friends. Let's hear from one of them to learn more.
Welcome. This is Enthusiastic English Journal. I'm Shoma Hashimoto. Today, April 18th, 2020, I will talk about false friends between Japanese and English. There are a lot of false friends, but strictly speaking, most Japanese people mistakenly use the words in their lives or believe them as English. Today, I will tell you 3 examples. If you remember this podcast, you can understand what your Japanese friends say. Maybe. Let's get started. Number 1. Smart. Many Japanese people use this word as slim. Even if your Japanese friends say, "Look, he is so smart," you mustn't assume that she can discern individual skill at a glance. But please understand, she wanted to say that he had a good shape. Number 2. Leisure. In Japanese, this word means amusement. In the past, leisure represented its original meaning in Japan. Then, why Japanese people now use it as amusement? Probably because people amuse themselves in their spare time. Number 3. Naive. Japanese use this word as sensitive or innocent. Naive originated in France, and it has positive and negative meanings. When it used in Japan, positive impression mainly occurred to them. On the other hand, in English-speaking country, negative impression, such as gullible, ignorant, occurred. Actually, in Japan, body wash named Naive is sold. What do you think of this body wash? Today, I talked about false friends. Did this podcast help you? I hope more Japanese people will have this perspective. If everyone had this point of view, many and more interesting false friends would be discovered. And these linguistic mutual understandings help us understand other culture. Thank you for listening. See you.
Thank you, Shoma. Great. So this was a great example of a podcast in my class over false friends. Shoma discussed 3 false friends. 1, smart or smarto. This one in Japanese, he explained, is used to describe people with a good shape or people who are slim. However, in English, the meaning is quite different. It means someone who is intellectually capable. A second false friend he mentioned was leisure. Could you hear that one? This one is a little bit different in the Japanese usage, as I'm sure you know. And the third one he mentioned was naive. In fact, this word naive also comes from French language. He mentioned that there is a body wash named Naive. But in fact, with this difference, it creates a humorous misunderstanding in English. Thank you, Shoma. So, this was a clip from the Enthusiastic English podcast. I've asked other students of mine to think about the origins of words. Just like naive, we started to think about gairaigo, or foreign originating words, as language learning opportunities. Here is one particular example that I like, the case of risent. Risent. This case comes from one of my favorite anime and manga, Hajime no Ippo. In this case, risent is a hairstyle. However, this word is a little bit strange. Why do we need the z in the Japanese form? It turns out this word came from a pre-war romanization or adaptation into Japanese language as z instead of j. In fact, if you say the word regent, I'm sure you're thinking of a photo like this in your mind, such as Elvis Presley. The Japanese meaning of this word is there. However, Do you know the historical origins of this word? It doesn't come from Elvis Presley. It comes from Regent Street in the United Kingdom. This place. This is where Regent hairstyle became popular. If you try to say the word regent or as regent to a native English speaker or any English speaker of world Englishes, we would get confused because in English this word especially refers to something called the pompadour. We call Elvis's hairstyle pompadour in English. Do you notice any trends in what we've seen so far with historical words of origin between English and other languages? Indeed, this word pompadour, like naive and manchon, also comes from French. Specifically, it comes from Madame Pompadour, one of the ladies of the court with Louis XV. So again, coming back to that image I showed you of the estate at the Grand Trianon, perhaps. But Madame Pompadour is quite different in terms of origin from Regent Street. But both of these words refer to the same idea, but in two different languages. So the point is to be careful when we use words of foreign origin. Another interesting area is differences or similarities in nonverbal communication tendencies. In a well-known study by Yuki, Maddox, and Yasuda, cross-cultural differences in attention to nonverbal cues were observed. Specifically, Japanese participants in their study were found to focus more on the eyes when evaluating emotions, whereas American participants focused more on the mouth when giving ratings for emotions. As you can see here, Japan is the white bar and the United States is the black bar. For emoji or emoticons, emoji, we can see that Japanese participants rated eyes much higher as happier compared to American participants. In the same way, for faces, American participants rated mouths with more emotional ratings relative to Japanese participants. This is an interesting difference of perception that can happen that is not meant to highlight cultural differences, but to show how we can make certain practical gains in our communication behavior. Specifically, you might notice this in the case of emoji themselves. In the case of three emotions, happy, neutral, and sad, you might have seen these smiley faces before. But have you seen Western style emoji? They look like this. Do you notice something about the differences in expression between Western and Japanese style emoji? Traditional emoji? That's right. The attention to the mouth is what changes in the Western style emoji, whereas in these Japanese style emoji, more expressiveness is seen with the eyes. So, I'd like to ask you at home, which emoticons or emoji do you use more often? Western or Japanese styles? Or maybe you use stickers. Go ahead, check your phone, look at Line, see whoever you've recently sent an emoji to. When I asked this question to my class, the answer was overwhelmingly Japanese style. And in fact, one of my students even polled some of their friends in my class regarding attention to the eyes or mouth and which tendency was higher. And it seemed that many of their especially East Asian friends and family and other participants seem to pay more attention to the eyes. So what does this mean for English? Well, for our English communication and context, one important point is to pay attention to the mouth. I do this to teach a linguistic educational tool called minimal pairs. Minimal means the least amount, and pairs, as you might realize or know, of course, means two. So in this case, I would like to start with some practice of phonological sounds. If you will see here in this figure, we have C. Can you try it with me at home? C. C. This is the unvoiced alveolar fricative. Fricative means, don't worry about that, we won't go there. But unvoiced alveolar comes from the lungs, okay? This differs greatly from the dreaded TH sound, this theta represents that, for the unvoiced dental fricative, or think. Think. The tongue comes from behind the teeth and underneath in between them to make this face. And then you blow air out to make the sound f. This differs from C. C doesn't use the tongue in this way. So let's practice. C. Think. Here are some minimal pairs. Sink. Think. Here's another one. Sing. Thing. Sought. Thought. Ooh, yes. All three of these minimal pairs use the S and TH difference. So let's play a little game at home. This activity is for you to identify and hear if I'm saying the first or second word pattern. So if I say sink, 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 could you hear it? That's 1, 1, 1. Okay? But if I say think, 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 2, 2, 2. Very good. So, what if I mix them? Sink, think, sink. Did you get it? 1, 2, 1. Very good. How about sing, sing, thing? 1, 1, 2. Very nice. How about thought, thought, sought? Yeah, 2, 2, 1. So this is a game you can play with your friends and family to practice English. In my class, we also work on vowel sounds, such as bath versus bus. Bath, bath, bus. 1, 1, 2. Very good. Here's another one. Bag and bug. Bug, bag, bug. 2, 1, 2. Very nice. And one of the more difficult ones incorporates R. In this case, first versus fast. First, fast, fast. First, first, first. Fast, fast, fast. First, fast, first. There's a lot in there. Good luck. So, if you'd like to try at home, here is some more pronunciation you can do in pairs or practice with your mom or dad or brother or sister, or even just at home by yourself. So I will read these for you so you can practice at home. The first minimal pair, fan, fun. Great. Hat, Hut. Nice. Collar means this. Color. Ooh, very subtle, right? Liter. Little. Light. Right. Okay? For light and right, the most challenging of all, right? So light, we typically like to say, take your hand like this and try light. Light versus right. Right. If you can make your hand into a gu and then move outward, you can imagine the shape of your tongue in your mouth. Light. Right. It's a little bit different, but if you practice, you might be able to make some changes if you like. Another one is clover, which in Japanese might be kuroba, right? But that differs from something called crowbar, a tool. Volleyball and ballet. This is an important one because in Japanese, the abbreviation of volleyball is bare, right? But the English speakers you talk to will misunderstand you as saying ballet. Oh, you did ballet? Which is a dance rather than volleyball, right? Fly, fry. Well, this is an important one, like Yamazaki Daily. Daily, dairy, Viking, biking. This is also a case of a false friend. Vikings were historically the people in Scandinavia who sailed and were great soldiers of a kind, as opposed to a buffet. The Japanese meaning of Vikingu is buffet in English, where there is an assortment of food that can be eaten. This is important because English speakers you interact with might misunderstand you as saying biking, which is to use a bicycle. Of course, we have glass versus grass. Good job. And rust. Rust means sabi. And last, saigo. This is important because if your tendency is to use the katakana pronunciation of dasto, it's very difficult for English speakers to understand this difference. So if you practice rust versus last, this vowel sound will help your pronunciation. Finally, match. Match versus much. Much. And lastly, pilots. Pilots versus pirates. Pirates, like Jack Sparrow. Okay, very good. So usually my students choose two that they'd like to practice, and then we have discussion. And the discussion question I recently asked was based on sources of this misunderstanding you might have had when interacting with an English speaker. So, I'd like to now ask you to, at home, try describing a previous experience you've had with an English speaker. Perhaps many of you have been to cultural activities, or maybe you did Eigo Anshoben non Taikai, the English speech and recitation contest. Indeed, I asked my students in a speaking assignment both of these things. Could you think of some false friends or pronunciation issues and any experiences you've had with foreigners abroad? And they mentioned that they had great opportunities to speak English at cultural events, school events, and even events at the embassy, Taishikan. As well as on the bus with tourists, with friends from other countries, and even with host families that they visited in countries such as New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, and the United States. For other false friends and sources of miscommunication, my students identified words such as pension, tension, right, in Japanese, this word in English, tension, sharp pencil, we talked about smart, talent, sweat, sweaters versus ase, sweat in English, trainers, we mentioned naive, but another great one is claim. This word claim is quite particular to the Japanese nuance. I'll just pick up one here, this one called tension. Tension in Japanese has the opposite meaning from English. To be so-called high tension means to have a lot of energy or a great rhythm of spirit, right? A kind of Genki, right? But in English, to be tense is to be nervous. It's not an excitement of a positive kind. To have tension is to be negatively affected by a situation. So when you're communicating in English and your instinct is to say, oh, I was feeling really high tension, perhaps if your interacting partner is an English speaker, they might be a little confused. So please take care when you say the word tension. All right? Another great one is this word consento. Consento in Japanese comes from the word concentric plug, which is a kind of area where you plug in your charger, right? But consent in English is a different word that means nattoku. So we have to be careful when we use this word coming from Japanese to English. Perhaps many of you in your experiences did try things like talking to an ALT or an assistant language teacher. In my case, in the United States, we also have events such as Eigo Anshon Benron Taikai, speech contests, but for a different kind of English practice. In my case, I was a spelling bee champion of the state of Oklahoma. I love the origins of words. This is me, 12 or 13. Yeah. And in our case, a spelling bee is a kind of event where you are asked to come to a stage and you're given a word. And you can ask a few questions like, what is the language of origin? To get a hint about how to spell this word. And judges choose from random this very difficult word for you to spell on the spot. So in our case, we use this kind of cultural activity to increase our English ability, usually through spelling. It's kind of like kanji kente, but for English words. All right? This is just to tell you that I love spelling so much and the origins of words, and I think it's important to become a better English speaker and a better person knowledgeable about culture and logic of the English language. For an example, I provided this table by a researcher named Keith Bars. This comes from an article called The Implications of Cross-Linguistic Lexical Similarities for Japanese Learners of English. Ooh, that's a lot of words. Don't worry, I've got you. So essentially, what Keith Bars did is he took a newspaper sample and he did corpus linguistics, コーパス言語学部からのやった研究法ですね。This kind of research method classifies katakana words into their gaidaigo yurai, languages of origin. In one newspaper sample, he found words like meika, come from maker in English, but I think many Japanese don't know that many katakana words do not come from English. They come from many other languages, such as German, This word, Thema, is a German word. So when you go to say, my Thema is, this is actually difficult for an English speaker to understand because the word Thema in English is theme. Theme. Okay? Another example would be the Portuguese word, Cristo, or there are many other Portuguese words, stemming to the history of Dejima in Nagasaki, as well as Sanskrit words and Spanish words like purachina, and even other kinds of phrases. So Keith Bars also looked at the kind of word that it is. What category? Is it a noun, meshi, adjective, keiyoshi, verb, doshi, or phrase, phrase? And in this case, he found the majority of katakana English words appear to be nouns in his sample. So words like fence, very normal categories of objects. He also found adjectives like ribureru na, liberal, is a case of Japanese to English, and the rare case of imeji suru, I mentioned earlier, purei suru, using surudoshi as a verb, and sometimes the odd phrase like never give up, never give up, right? So, as you can see, there are certain properties of the words you already know in English, or words that come from English into Japanese language. But the trick is how to learn which words are more appropriate to make more easy to understand English conversation. I think one way to do this is to focus on phrases such as never give up, or summer is around the corner. In my course, we focused on time-based phrases like your past is behind you, or spring has passed. Your past is behind you shows you something about the logic of English language. In English, the tendency is to have some place of fixation for words to work around, as is the case with Japanese. However, my students identified some rather interesting English idioms or frequently used cultural expressions. In a podcast by my student Naoto, he entitled Only Time Will Tell, he found many kinds of English idioms. Let's take a listen and learn from Naoto.
Judging by only words, I thought that old times were all events including good events and bad events in the past. But that only refers to good events. I didn't know that. The last phrase is once in a blue moon. This means very rarely. I think this is difficult for us to understand because we can't guess the meaning without knowing the blue moon. So, what is the blue moon? A blue moon is a special full moon that is rarely seen. I don't know if a blue moon is familiar to English speakers or not, but as far as I've heard from my Japanese friends, it is unfamiliar to us. By the way, according to folklorist Philip Hiscock, a professor at Memorial University in Newfoundland, the notion of a blue moon first appeared in writing in 16th century, and by the 1700s, this phrase was used to mean very rarely. But I couldn't find why this phrase came to have that meaning.
Thank you, Naoto. So Naoto was explaining the case of a phrase called once in a blue moon. Once in a blue moon is a very particular cultural expression that means rarely. As he explained, this comes from a folklore usage of this term blue moon, a kind of harvest moon. So this moon only happens once in a while. So we begin to use this English phrase, once in a blue moon. My students also identified many other English idioms when they do another unique feature of my course or watch a movie that features English language without subtitles and then watch it a second time with subtitles. In this case, they found new phrases like "see you later, alligator," and "toodles," or "it's now or never," and 16 going on 17. All kinds of very rich and descriptive English expressions are waiting for you in many media environments, such as film and television. So I really encourage you to pick up hobbies like podcasts or film or TV with English language sources so that you can get more exposure. I also want to think more and have my students think more about encoding nonverbal communication with English expressions. So we've talked about the cultural and historical elements. We've talked about linguistic origins, but also there is a fascinating case of how we use gesture to express ideas. This is a really interesting and ambiguous question that is a normal English phrase. Next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days. What day is it on now? What day do you think? Next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days. What day is it on now? Perhaps you're thinking the answer is Friday. That's a pretty good answer. Or maybe you're thinking the answer is Monday. How about now? Next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days. What day is it on now? Next Wednesday's meeting has been moved forward 2 days. What day is it on now? You can see a difference in your interpretation of this English expression with the gesture, either moving away from the body or toward the body. This shows you something about the logic of English and also the logic of most languages in how we have pragmatic interpretations. So, in this case, this is a fascinating experimental stimuli. 実験にあるの刺激ですね。To determine whether or not a person can correctly identify more or less a given phrase with expressions. This was done by a man by the name of Dr. Bodo Winter at the University of Birmingham. And you can access his discussion about this phenomenon in this video. In it, he describes these two hypotheses about mental time. One is called the moving ego, or me, moving, versus the moving deadline, or time as an object moving. Both of these involve self-motion. And he found in his study that when you motion toward yourself, or when one motions toward themselves, more Monday answers or responses were endorsed by participants in his study, meaning that they were closer in time, versus motion away from the self moved towards Friday. This is quite interesting, to me at least. I hope so for you. This is also the case with the way that English encodes certain fundamental words like left to right versus right to left. In English, we write from left to right, correct? It is the case that participants from cultures where the direction of orthography, which means writing left to right, is left to right, respond more quickly to past events with their left hand and future events with their right hand. So English speakers often refer to the past. I went there before and I will go there tomorrow. The future with their right hand. This is so habitually encoded that to do otherwise is strange for me. I don't know how to say, for example, on the one hand, but on the other hand. I have to start with my left hand into my right hand. If I say on the one hand and on the other hand, I get a very big sense of unnatural feeling, like fushizan or iwakan. So in this case, though, fascinatingly, even though this is default for English speakers, for Chinese speakers or people knowledgeable of Chinese language, it can go either way. Chinese speakers can say on the one hand or on the other hand with either hand. This is a unique feature of Chinese expression. So this is one way to illustrate how language can embody our thinking in ways that when you want to become a better communicator, it's cool or important or maybe sometimes necessary to think about how gesture and nonverbal communication, just like the eyes and mouth, are involved in the ways that you're communicating. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about culture, because it's extremely hard to separate culture and language and the traces that it leaves on language. In addition to being a professor, and while not being Jay Gatsby, I am also a musician. And I love to play at cultural events, as well as give artist-in-residency talks on American poetry, contemporary poetry. I did this in Akita Prefecture at Yuri Honjo Cultural Center, Bunka Kaikan Kadare. For me, talking a great deal about either my culture in America or the culture of songwriting and music, as well as poetry, is something that I'm very passionate about and something that I think defines a piece of my cultural identity. In language and in culture and in socialization, this has an actual special phenomenon. This is called becoming a speaker of culture. This woman is Eleanor Ox, and she is the one who coined this phrase that in her field of language socialization examines ways that individuals become members of a community of practice by using language. For example, perhaps you do chado, sado, or maybe you are someone who does karate. Karate has a special language that you use. You refer to people as sensei, or you refer to moves that you do with Japanese language. The same is true for fencing. I was also a fencer of saber, the saber fencing. Okay? And for fencing, many of the words we use in the practice of our community of fencers come from French. So we would wear a lamé, which is a kind of special vest for when you are fencing. Or for me, songwriting comes from a lot of blues-related American expressions. Jazz often is an American export, so sometimes American culture is with jazz. There are different cultural elements to communities of practice. And so when you become a better communicator of any culture, whether it's making figurines or whether it's doing ikebana, some element of that makes you a speaker of culture when you become sufficiently socialized in the language of ikebana or the language of fencing. So what does this mean? For me, it means that one of our goals when we want to become better at English communication is to adopt these elements of cultural features of world Englishes in Australia, the UK, even Japanese English. Each of these has important features that we should maintain and think about. And sometimes they're predicated or they're based on tendencies of context and culture. One of my students beautifully described this phenomenon in anthropology known as high versus low context cultures. I would like to refer you to my student Yui to learn more about this phenomenon.
My topic of podcast is verbal communication from the viewpoint of high context culture and low context culture. And high context culture means the culture where people don't have to use much language or information when they talk to. It's very suggestive and ambiguous style of communication, and so this culture is sometimes called stepping stone style because the information is very sporadic and people need to read between the lines and find hidden meanings in something said or written through the situations or the context. And people in this culture are ashamed to have the common understandings, and Korea, China, Arab countries, Italy, Greece, and Russia are the example of this culture, and Japan is the best country to explain this culture. And this country tends to be a racially homogeneous nation, and people relatively have a tendency to act as a group. And on the other hand, low context culture means the culture where people have to give all the information by language when they talk to someone. So it's very logical and explicit style of communication. And this culture is sometimes called stone pavement style because a lot of information is put neatly as if the path is paved with small stones. And as people don't have much background knowledge in common, so they need to verbalize as much information as possible to avoid making misunderstandings. And the US, Switzerland, Iceland, Sweden, and Denmark are the example of this culture, and Germany is the best country to represent this culture. And this culture tend to be a multinational and individualistic country. And I think when we communicate with people in other countries, we need to vary the style of verbal communication according to the situation. For example, when we make a presentation at the international places or in front of people with whom we don't share enough background knowledge, we should choose the low context culture style of communication. And meanwhile, when we talk to people with whom we've already built the common knowledge, common understandings, it might be rude if we use the low context culture style of communication because it seems to imply that they can't understand the information well. So we should be able to figure out which style is more effective depending on where we speak or who we talk to.
Great. Thank you so much, Yui. So, there at the end, she expresses this idea about intercultural understanding and intercultural communication, meaning knowing when it is appropriate to use low versus high context when in a cultural circumstance, when communicating in a cultural circumstance. So low context culture is being characterized by less knowledge in that situation versus high, where things are more relationship based as opposed to task based. These kinds of ways of communicating are things we discuss in my classes, and as she beautifully described, show these distinctions as tendencies across many countries and their characteristics. So in our classes, we like to emphasize this understanding of cultural communication as a basis for becoming better at English, but not only English, many other languages and their tendencies as well. This extends to types of cultures. in which you might find a good summary for the things we've described so far, nonverbal communication tendencies, language features, social features, in this table in this book by David Matsumoto, Nonverbal Communication, Science and Applications, specifically this chapter on cultural influences on nonverbal behavior. This shows that there are tendencies in the source of nonverbal communication, such as faces, gestures, voice, and gaze, or how you're looking, and interpersonal space and touch, as well as posture, she's saying, right? So he categorizes these into two main types, expressive and reserved types of culture. Expressive cultures are characterized by having many animated facial expressions and regularly expressing emotions and using the face to amplify and illustrate and emphasize speech. Whereas reserved cultures have fewer of these and more controlling expressions. The idea is to inhibit some of the emotional expression happening outwardly. Okay? And in expressive cultures, again, gestures are larger with motions and have a high frequency of emblem usage. Emblem means these special kinds of gestures that are between cultures. Whereas reserved cultures tend to have less of these. Voices are louder and deeper versus softer in reserved cultures. Gaze is more direct in the eyes versus not direct in some less direct gaze when you're speaking to someone in reserved cultures for respect, as well as closer distances when interacting, more likely to touch versus farther ones, less likely, more relaxed and open postures versus less relaxed. So this is a good way to classify and think about the ways that nonverbal communication tendencies can vary between culture and how we interpret those when we become better at English communication, which tends to be more of a vivacious, sort of gregarious style of language and communication. So one question I might ask you if you were a member of my class is Japan a reserved or expressive culture to you? Why or why not? This is an example of a kind of debate topic, the final major feature of my English communication course. We engage in rhetorical exercises in order to sharpen our views and ideas and improve ourselves through civil discourse. These debates are friendly and they're a kind of dialogue or conversation between partners. This is one way I believe really helps facilitate better English communicators. So we engage in Socratic debate and dialogue. This is heavily influenced from a book I recommend called Plato at the Googleplex by Rebecca Newberger-Goldstein, who shows how debate, especially conversation, can lead to a discovery of ideas. In this book, she imagines Platon walking around today in modern day at Google in California. That's where this image comes from, is Plato on a well-known television late-night talk show and what he would say in modern day. We also try to embody the spirit of Plato and Socrates by engaging in dialogic speech to expose ourselves to our own ideas, to receive new ideas from our interacting partner, and even to come to an understanding through the act of deliberation. So an example debate question we used in our class was, Japanese schools should stop requiring school uniforms. Are you for or against this? How many of you support? How many of you object to this notion? And we use a mediator or someone in between to moderate this discussion between two partners. To give you an example, I have one group from my course who discussed the consequences of changes to schools due to the coronavirus. let's hear from Izumi, Kotaro, and Sorami.
Today, many children are stopped from going to their school due to the influence of coronavirus. To solve their delay on studying, some politicians say the educational system starting school in April is be changed to September. So, are you for or against this change? How about Kotaro?
Hi, I'm Kotaro. I'm in affirmative position. I have some merits of introduction of the idea to start our school in September. First, we can compensate the time of huge blank. Please think about if there are no extended times, how we can reschedule and get enough time to teach the children what they need to. It's absolutely difficult to do it. Secondly, it could be easy to embrace the exchange students from a lot of other major countries. It doesn't seem a big merit, but after some years passed, it might cause a lot of good effect on education for international communication skills. In addition, winter is not a good season for examinee because snowing prevents transportation service. Also, it is season which flu is prevailing. So I think we'd better to switch the plan of starting in September.
I see. So let me know more specific example about embracing foreign students.
Okay. So these days, more and more countries are adopted our introduction of school not opening their school on September. Like UK, America, China, and France, and so on. That is a major country for exchange student for language, for getting another language skills. So this is a huge merit.
Okay. So how about Izumi? Are you for or against?
Okay. I disagree with the idea because the idea can cause many problems, especially nowadays. Many schools have one same question. It's lacking of teachers and equipment. So if the situation happens, students' schools budget will increase. So that's all.
Okay.
Thank you so much to the three of them. So in this case, you can see this debate activity essentially worked such that Sorami explained and mediated this discussion by beginning with the topic of this question, in which Kotaro answered his view and in the affirmative, supporting the idea that schools should open in September as opposed to April for general elementary schools due to the changes of coronavirus. And his reasoning was that in the case of foreign students that are coming from abroad to universities, many of the major countries already finish or begin their terms around that time. So his reasoning was there behind that. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, Izumi was arguing that it will cause issues with budgetary constraints. So you can see these two viewpoints that we then engage with in our course, especially with Sorami at the middle, probing with more clarification. This is a very specific kind of educational method and tool you might not yet have been exposed to before, but you have the opportunity to try here in courses like mine at Hiroshima University. And this is Socratic questioning. So just like we had a Socratic debate, thinking about the way that Plato would do dialogue and having dialogue and debate, we use Socratic questioning as a disciplined approach to determining the truth value or validity of ideas by asking questions that clarify. Could you give us an example, as Sorami mentioned? Could you put it in another way? Questions that initialize an issue. Does this question lead to other important questions? Ones that probe the assumption. Why would someone make this assumption? Looking at the origin. Is this your idea or did you hear it from somewhere else? And viewing the implications. Well, if we do that, what else could happen? In this case, Izumi mentions, if we adopt this policy, something could happen with the budget, as an example. And finally, other kinds of questions that detail the viewpoint. How would other groups of people respond to this question? And why? Kotaro especially attacked this idea, made a great example by saying other groups of people might benefit from being able to come in September, as an example. So these kinds of Socratic questioning skills are ways that I try to promote critical thinking. So we've done critical thinking in the form of identification and many other forms. But as a final couple of slides, I'd just like to challenge you at home to summarize and classify. Which topics did you find the most interesting in my talk today and with the talk from my students? Perhaps it was false friends across languages like manshon, image. Or maybe you were interested in the gairaigo origins, or the minimal pairs like sink and think, sing and thing. Or maybe you were interested in the cross-cultural tendencies in communication, like the eyes and the mouth, or gestures and time, high and low context cultures, expressive and reserved cultures, or this form of Socratic questioning and debate. How would you classify these two major ideas that we touched on in today's lecture? Maybe you would describe the ones on the left as language features, whereas the ones on the right, social and cultural features. That's right. So I promote these approaches to English communication to give these ideas the opportunity to breathe and to give you context to have a greater and deeper and richer understanding of why we should improve ourselves as communicators, not just in English, but in all of our languages. And this comes from an idea of promoting international posture, which consists of gaining an interest in foreign affairs, wanting to go overseas and engage and interact with intercultural partners, and adopt a non-ethnocentric attitude toward different cultures. Every language is a window on the world, and tracing the origins of our words familiarizes us with our history and allows us to recognize our common humanity. It's especially necessary in this time. And I really think that paying attention to these language features and sociocultural tendencies are small steps towards obtaining this international posture and overcoming barriers to communication. So I'll leave this with Wittgenstein. I imagine him telling us and telling you, finding ways to overcome misunderstanding from language is where we become not false friends, but true friends. Thank you very much for listening.